Hey guys, how's it going? My name's Workcat, and in today's video, I just wanted to give a quick overview / tutorial on how I made this little cake scene with my new Blender add-on PaintKit. Now, for those of you who aren't already aware, PaintKit is an add-on designed specifically for helping Blender artists create stylized, painterly assets in Blender. I've had a lot of fun integrating this into my workflow, and it's helped me create stylized assets a lot faster and a lot easier. So check the links down below, grab yourself a copy, and let's get into this tutorial. So starting off here, I'm just going to model the basic parts of the scene. All I really need is just a plate, a piece of cake, and a strawberry. There's nothing too complicated going on here. I'm just taking a basic cube, joining some vertices, and then making it into a cake shape. And then after all that, I just want to make sure I go and proportional edit some of the vertices after it's subdivided, just to make it look a little bit more organic, because a perfect triangular prism of cake doesn't make much sense. And once I've got everything set up, I'm just going to go ahead and UV unwrap everything because I'm going to be texture painting most of this, and all of the heavy lifting is going to be done through texture. So I want to make sure I have my UVs laid out at least halfway decent, just so I can get some okay texture resolution here and there. And then once I have everything laid out, I'm just going to go ahead and start painting. There's nothing too complicated to go over here. It's just paint. Very basic texture paint tutorial can teach you how to do this. I'm not going to go over it because this is more geared towards PaintKit, but if you want to learn that, I'll have some links down below. So with everything set up, let's get into the actual point of this tutorial, PaintKit. I wanted this video to be more of a process and actually show how I'm using this in the workflow instead of just going, oh, here's how each and every single node works, because that's kind of boring. So what I have here, I just have the basic scene setup. It's going into a principled node, and I'm going to delete that immediately, and I'm just going to add C-Tune Diffuse. This is just an oversight on my part here because I forgot I'm in Eevee now, so this can just be any diffuse shader. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring in an HSV Bender node. This node group lets me do hue, saturation, and value changes using an input texture, which can give it a lot more detail. And I also added a HSV after it, just to kind of give it a little bit more punch. So I find myself a paint texture that I think would look good, and I put that into the input of the HSV Bender node. So now when I start sliding these values around, you can see that I'm actually getting a really interesting change on the hue of the cake here. So it kind of looks a little bit more unintentional, or almost like a playing with color look that CG art typically doesn't have, because it's very sharp and rendered very high quality all the time. And I'm also going to add another HSV Bender and use the graphic effect node as the input for that, just because I really like the sharp lines and shapes that the graphic effect node can kind of make. And I'm just mixing all these textures together using different blending modes, whichever one I think looks nice at the time. This time I think I went with color dodge, but definitely play around with different blending modes when you're mixing textures like this, because it can really create interesting effects that you didn't necessarily think of when you first started making things. So after adding some color adjustments and different color ramps to just kind of mix up the color on the object, I'm going to add in a normal painter node. Now, normal painter, like the name suggests, lets you make your normals kind of painterly. And the way it does this is it's going to take your input normals and then break them up into discrete chunks. And then you can change the size of those chunks so that when your object gets shaded, the normals that it's using to shade those things are more broken up and discrete, kind of like different strokes of paint when you're shading a smooth object. And I'm just going to kind of play with these values a little bit, roughen up some of those paint edges. And I'm also going to use the original texture overlay that I'm using as the input texture for the normal painter node. And this just makes the normal breakup a little more real when you start offsetting it because it's based on an actual paint texture. So now with this applied, you can see we're getting a lot more interesting shading on our object. It's not just smooth all the way around. We're actually getting kind of chunky areas of shaded and light and midtones. So it looks really interesting. And now moving on to the strawberry, I did the same exact process here. I actually used images of strawberries and then I used that to project onto the model, and then I baked that afterwards so I have something to kind of base my painting off of. I like using this project, bake, and then paint over technique a lot because it helps me to paint things that I'm not terribly comfortable with because I'm an okay painter, but there's a lot of things that I don't think I could pull off very convincingly. So this is super helpful for kind of giving me a guideline on like how things are actually supposed to look when they're on the model. And it also lets me work from a base and then kind of stretch things from there instead of just going full from scratch. There's nothing wrong with making things fully from scratch. I'm just not a terribly experienced painter. So it's really totally up to you how you want to do these things. So now once I have my strawberry painted, I'm actually just going to go ahead and go back into the cake shader and just copy some of those normal painter nodes over and bring them into the strawberry, just because it makes it a little easier to not repeat yourself over and over. And now I'm gonna go through kind of the same process with the strawberry here, using a different texture for the HSV bender, but the idea is still the same. And now additionally, on top of all the HSV bender stuff and texture overlays, I'm actually going to run the base color first into an acrylic stroke node. Now this node is a procedural texture that kind of mimics acrylic strokes of paint, or kind of like oil-ish, and you can actually use a color input on that, so it kind of adds extra brushstroke texture on top of the thing that you've already painted. Because I like the way this thing was looking, but it still kind of had that digital edge of some of the brushstrokes. So I make some tweaks here and there with the stroke size, the hue shift, and all that. And then I just start moving around my strawberry asset and kind of finish out the little layout that I have going. And now once that was all set up, I kind of felt like the cake was still a little dry looking, so I wanted to add a bit of strawberry sauce on top of things. And so the way I did that is I just took a plane and I extruded it to kind of look like it's something that could be going over the cake. And then I used a subdivision surface modifier and a solidify modifier to just kind of smooth all these edges out and then just give it a bit of thickness. And so after extruding all of these little drip areas and kind of an area that runs onto the plate, I just did a few tweaks here and there to kind of make it look a little bit more blobby. And then I started setting up my material. And now the strawberry sauce actually took me a minute to figure out because Eevee can be a little finicky with transparent type materials. And what I actually ended up doing to give it a little bit more extra shine is I added a layer weight node and then mixed that on top of the original texture to kind of give it a little bit more white along some of the edges so it looks a little bit glossier. And I fed that into a glass node that also had normal painter applied to it. And then I did just a bit of shader to RGB stuff where I took a glossy shader and added that on top of our original glass shader just to make it a little bit shinier. And now the last thing to do before setting up the brush strokes is set up the plate. And the plate was very simple. I just used a watercolor group and then actually fed the watercolor texture into a color ramp to drive a little bit of difference between some whites and yellows to kind of make it look like more of a faded china plate. And then of course copied the normal painter node that I had already used back into that as well. And then after all that, I felt it wasn't really shiny enough, so I just added a glossy shader on top of all that. And so now I've got all my objects and materials set up, and now it's time to actually apply brush strokes to these. Now in this overview, I used both methods of add brush strokes and also add simple shell, just to give you some examples of options that you might use. So the first thing you'll notice here when I add brush strokes and then turn the shrink wrap toggle on is we still don't have any texture on our brush strokes. Now this is happening because it doesn't know how to read the UVs of the brush strokes yet because it hasn't gotten that information. And to get this information, we have to use the brush sampled UV group. Now through the geometry node system that this works on, it allows our brush strokes to actually take their normal and project it onto the surface, and wherever that lands, that's where it's going to sample the UV data from. So now any texture that you have applied to your original object is now going to be properly mapped onto your brush strokes. The one caveat being that this is working through geometry, so that means our density of data isn't terribly strong if we don't have a lot of geometry, because geometry nodes is sampling this through vertices. And because of that, our resolution for how well we're able to actually sample the UVs currently relies on the resolution of the cards themselves. This means that when you have low resolution cards, you are going to get some odd artifacting when it's trying to interpolate the UV across that surface and you're going over a seam on your object. I'm still working on a fix for this and trying to figure out a workaround, but currently it hasn't given me too many issues. For me, most of the time it's kind of added to the look just because it kind of looks like an unintentional oops of a paintbrush, but it can definitely be annoying in some cases. And if that is the case, I suggest using high resolution cards, applying your brush strokes, and then decimating it afterwards, because then you can still get this higher resolution data, but still have less geometry to deal with when you're actually trying to process and make your scene. So now I just start adjusting the size of my brush strokes, and I actually want to add the brush stroke texture onto our strokes now, because currently they're just cards, but they don't really have any brush-like texture to them. So the way we're going to fix that is we're going to use an add brush text group, and this just allows you to use a texture input as a kind of transparency mask for your individual brush cards. And now, similar to getting the texture to properly apply to the brush strokes, we also need to figure out what UV we need to use for the individual brush cards. And it's pretty simple to get that information. You just use the brush attribute group and you use card UV. And this just gives you the UV information of all of your different generated card brush strokes. And so you can see when I plug in the texture, they're not going the right direction. And all I need to do is add a mapping node and just change the rotation on the Z to 90 degrees to just swap them so that they're facing the correct direction to kind of follow the intended flow of the strokes. And so once I've got my brush texture set up, I want to do some adjustments to the actual look of the cards themselves. So I'll add in a backface culling group, and all this will do is make it transparent to the render anytime it's going out through the back of one of these faces. And this can be super handy, especially in cycles, if you're getting weird bounce lighting coming between your strokes and your object. And then on top of that, I'm also going to add an exclude shadows group. And this does exactly what it says. It excludes your brushes from actually casting any shadows onto your object, which 9 times out of 10, you're not going to want them to do. And so once I've got all that out of the way, the only thing left to do is make final adjustments and do some tweaks to the brush strokes just to make sure they're not interfering with the glassy material of the strawberry sauce object. And so in this project, I actually just went ahead and hit apply brush strokes. Now what this does, it just turns your brush strokes into a mesh. And then it joins it with the original object. And if you ever need these things separated, or like here, I just want to select only the brush strokes, it automatically gets sorted into 2 different vertex groups of the original object and then the original object's name underscore brush. So you can just use the vertex group panel options to select, deselect, or assign and unassign. And so in this case, to minimize these issues with the EV transparency, all I did is I went ahead and took the brush strokes that are kind of showing up funny through the strawberry sauce, and I just went ahead and selected them and deleted them. They're super easy to select if you use Control L, because then you can just select one vertex and then it will just select all linked vertices from that. And so now the cake is looking pretty good. So I'm gonna move on to the strawberries. And with the strawberries, I use the simple shell method, and this just creates a glorified solidify modifier around your object and lets you mask out just that outside layer using any texture. And what I ended up doing for this one is I used the displacement output of the original acrylic strokes group in our strawberry object and used the displacement output of that for the shell mask input of our simple shell group. And so by using this displacement output, I'm getting different values for every single brush stroke that it generates, which allows me to then just add a really tight color ramp to kind of sort between those brush strokes and say yes or no on any given brush stroke. And additionally, I brought in a shell attributes node to actually use the index as the W seed for our acrylic strokes node. And I also used a shell attributes node to use the index of the shell to drive the W value of our acrylic strokes group. And what this lets us do is, this lets us use the index as a random seed. And this lets us use the index as sort of a pseudo-random seed for the acrylic strokes so that every new layer we add of shell, we're actually going to get slightly different offset texture, which will make a lot more convincing effect when you start layering that instead of just having the same texture mask occurring over and over. And then just like the cake paint strokes, I added a backface culling just because I tend to like the look that that gives. And Simple Shell has quite a bit of the other options already working as well. And then finally, I used add brush strokes on the plate as well, and then just copied over the add brush text nodes from the other shaders. And then I just added a few more tweaks, animated some things a little bit, added a ground plane, and then rendered out my final video. I hope this video kind of gives you a better overview and understanding of how you can actually use these tools in your existing workflow. And of course, like and subscribe and all that stuff, because I really want to make more tutorials like this and also show how I built PaintKit. Because in these tutorials, I really want to value showing you the process of how these things actually work instead of just understanding things on a surface level. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.